Hi guys, I'm Rohan Raval. Welcome to Numbers. Let's talk about NMAT 2016, the analysis and the experience of the NMAT takers by far. So NMAT had 3 sections this year as every year. So we had 48 questions in Quant DI, LR we had logical reasoning, we had 40 questions and 32 questions in verbal ability, together giving us 120 questions, and every question was for 3 marks, no negative marking, so total marks 360 for the paper. Let's talk about every section and what areas were emphasized in each of the sections. So let's start with the first area. When we talk about NMAT Quant, arithmetic has always monopolized the area. Even this year it didn't change. So again we had around 9 to 10 questions of quant just from arithmetic. So there were questions on chapters like percentages, where there was increment and decrement of percentage asked. Percentage, profit and loss, there were questions on the dishonest shopkeeper kind of questions, and the MRP kind of the questions. Okay, when it comes to simple interest, compound interest, there was a question on merging in simple interest and compound interest. So basically you're comparing two things. When it comes to time, speed and distance, there were questions on both strains and relative speeds. So make sure you know all of these concepts. When it comes to time and work, there was a question based on the efficiency model. In other words, MDH by W kind of question. There were questions asked on variations. Keep that in mind. If it's direct variation, the ratio is constant. Inverse variation, the product is constant. So I suggest you must do all the concepts of these chapters thoroughly if you're really looking forward to clear your cutoff in quant area for NMAT 2016. When it comes to the next topic, numbers, you had 4 to 5 questions on numbers. There were questions on HCF, questions on LCM, questions on the highest power, on factorization, remainder. So make sure you know all your remainder theorems really well, especially Euler's and formats really well when you go for the paper. There were questions on a raised to n minus b raised to n, where a plus b is a factor only if n is even, and a minus b is a factor irrespective of the value of n. Surprisingly, this year in geometry, there are a lot of property based questions to geometrical figure, like that, given that something like, let's say for example I take a property like diagonals of this particular quadrilateral bisect each other. So what all possibilities of quadrilaterals are there? Which of the following will be true for which quadrilateral? Like those kind of true or false question were also asked on geometry. So make sure you know all the properties. If your NMAT attempt is within a week or two, make sure you write all these concepts down separately in a book and keep revising these concepts over and again. Also, there were questions on 3-dimensional geometry, just the mensuration side of it, and there were questions on coordinate geometry, on distance formula and slopes of lines. When it comes to the next topic, permutation combination, there were again 3 to 4 questions asked on basic permutation and combination, which is selecting and forming teams, and string method and gap method, in other words. Arithmetic progression, there was one question on arithmetic progression and geometric progression as well. There were questions on quadratic equation, again the basics. So basically you must know the discriminant and the nature of root kind of questions, which are interrelated obviously. There were questions on logarithms when it comes to again the properties of logarithms. So make sure you know all the properties of logarithms, right from base change till the basic properties of indices and logarithms. And there were a few miscellaneous questions asked on summations of n and summation of n square, etc., which you had to use ultimately in this particular exam. So in other words, if you notice carefully, I would say that quant was somewhere, the level of quant by far is somewhere from easy to moderate. If I have a scale of 10, I would say it is from 1 to let's say around a 4ish. Okay, not more than that. So if you know all the concepts really well, if you revise your concepts thoroughly, you keep them handy, and you are a little bit good with calculating, I'm sure you'll be able to clear the quant cutoff if you're writing NMAT in this particular month. When it comes to DI, they had asked a lot of questions on mixed graph. There were a lot of questions where you had bars and pies together, bars and lines together, etc. There were 2 to 3 sets at least, having 3 or 4 questions. Depending on that, we had around 12 to 16 questions on data interpretation. There were a few papers where they just had single graph. So one set of single graph for 3 questions, giving you a total of 3, or maybe sometimes 2 set giving you a 6 question. However, this was not so prevalent. More or less 80 to 90% of the papers had mixed sets, which means DI was difficult in 80 to 90% of the papers by far. It was not just calculation intensive, it was also the concept clarity intensive. In other words, you must know how do you exactly mix 2 graphs and get them to one. There were few papers where there was miscellaneous DI asked, one set of miscellaneous DI. So basically only one set having 3 questions per set. Alright, so DI as a whole, I would rate it from moderate to difficult, and I'll talk about how to strategize exactly when it comes to DI. So this was like moderate to difficult. When it comes to the subsection of quant area. When it comes to the last section of quant area, last subsection, data sufficiency, there were 5 to 6 questions on an average in every paper, and they were very easy questions. So when it comes to attempting quant, I would rather suggest a couple of tips from my end, right? Again, the focus here was on concept clarity. So if you know the concepts of all chapters of quant, I'm sure anyone would be able to crack these 5 to 6 questions, as they were sitters. They were just based on concepts. So in other words, out of 48 questions that we had in quant, anything around 30 to 31 would be a good score and will help you clear the cutoff when it comes to this particular area, section 1 of quant. I would rather suggest you must prioritize solving data sufficiency, because these 5 to 6 questions are sitters. Focus on your arithmetic skills, do your concepts, revise everything thoroughly, do your numbers and geometry. Try to avoid data interpretation, because of one simple reason, that NMAT is strategically made in a manner that the cutoff of NMAT doesn't go. If you notice, the cutoff usually doesn't go beyond 208 to 210 marks out of the 360 that you have total. Okay, now this is because of one simple reason, that they will ask you questions which will be like not solvable given the amount of time, because the number of minutes that you have per question is practically 1 minute a question. So they will give out such questions where you'll take more than a minute or you'll get stuck. They want you to get stuck, keep that in mind. So in such cases, I would rather recommend, do not try to solve DI at all, or even if at all you're not good at quant, or you kind of like are lagging behind in the number of attempts when it comes to quant, you can try out one set. So first go through the DI set for sure, check it out if it's a solvable one, and then proceed to solve the particular set. Otherwise, do not even touch data interpretation. That would be my recommendation to all of you out there. Okay, so recognize the DI set and then go for it if in case. Alright, that's about quant. Let's go to the next section, which is logical reasoning. When it comes to the 40 questions of logical reasoning in NMAT, they were divided as follows. So first of all, we had caselets and setting arrangements, 2 to 3 sets, and we had 3 to 4 questions per set, giving us 6 to 10 questions just of caselets and setting arrangements. A few paper had difficult caselets, however. Majority of the paper had moderate to difficult kind of caselets, I would say. Alright, so make sure that do not attempt caselets at the start of the paper. So you can start with one-liner logical reasoning. For example, the next thing that was asked was blood relation. You can do this first, like just to start the paper, so that you can solve more questions in less amount of time, leaving more time for this particular area. So blood relation, there were 2 to 3 questions based on basics of blood relation. Direction, there was 1-2 question in every paper. There were questions on verbal reasoning. So in verbal reasoning, I'm talking about statement assumptions. There were questions, statement conclusions. There were questions, statement inferences, course of action, and there were questions on assertion reason. So these 5 to 6 areas, you had 1 question or 2 questions maybe from 2 to 3 areas in every paper. So in other words, giving us 5 to 6 questions, a very simple question. If you just follow the basic rules, you can check out my videos on assumptions, conclusions, and inferences on my YouTube channel here itself, and you'll get to know the basic rules. If you follow the basic rules, you will get 100% accuracy in this. There were 3 to 4 questions asked on coding, decoding in every paper. There was one set of Venn diagram where there was a triple Venn diagram given to you, and there was another set where there was a pass and fail Venn diagram given to you. So you might go through these types of questions as well. When it comes to input output, it is very difficult across all papers. Cracking the code was really difficult because it was all about numbers, and the way it was sequenced was really difficult to crack in the given amount of time. And series and odd man out, the same thing. So these two areas again were like data interpretation in the first section. So having said the same thing earlier, keep this in mind that you're supposed to leave out input output and series. Just look at them once. If you think you can crack it, it's fair, just go for it. Otherwise, just leave it there. Okay, do not try to attempt these 5 to 8 kind of questions. Okay, there were also questions on math puzzles and miscellaneous questions where you had a box given to you, and then there were numbers written out here, and you had to find the number in the fourth quadrant. So this is how the entire logical ability was divided. So I would suggest focus on verbal reasoning for sure, and the one-liner logic basically till here. Do not emphasize much on input, output, and series. These are just like, they're just created to kind of make you waste time when it comes to the paper, because logical reasoning is 40 questions and you just have 38 minutes, so practically less than a minute a question. So you cannot afford to spend time in something like an input, output, or series that are too obsolete, because given the amount of time, it is very difficult to crack the logic of such questions. and obviously towards the end, or maybe you can do one or two caselets right at the start. So just go through the caselet, look at the caselet, how's it exactly. If it looks solvable, it looks comprehensive, just go for it there itself. Otherwise leave it for the middle of the paper or towards the end of the paper, but make sure you go through all of these areas from 2 to 6 that I've mentioned definitely in the first go, and also try math puzzles and miscellaneous questions because they are very simple. Talking about verbal ability had 32 questions, and this was one of the easiest of the sections of NMAT this year as per the feedback of all the NMAT takers by far. So we had reading comprehension, we had 2 comprehensions, 4 questions per comprehension. The best part was these were all fact-based comprehension based on the famous topics. Just have a look at the topics. So if you look at, these were the topics basically asked for verbal ability. So you must read articles on these topics to help you get through your verbal ability. Also, these topics will help you clear your GD, WAT, GE and CD depending on whatever calls you have. So articles on economics, management, literature, science and technology, history, political science, philosophy, psychology, law, religion, mythology, also evolution. I would like to add one more, so you can also go for a topic like evolution, so Darwinian theory or something like that. So this was also an emphasis again on NMAT. So all were like fact-based questions, so not a big deal at all. When it comes to parajumbles, you had 2 to 3 questions on parajumbles, again a very straightforward one. Then we had fill in the blanks. Fill in the blanks were 1 or 2 questions based on you have to fill in the blank as per the appropriate word used in the context of the sentence. When it comes to grammar, there were questions on prepositions, there were questions on articles, there were questions on conjunctions as well, there were questions on clauses and fill in the blanks. So make sure you know your parts of speech really well before you write your NMAT. There were 5 to 6 questions on synonyms and antonyms. There were repeated questions, repeated words from the 500 famous words of NMAT. So you can go for the top 500 words of NMAT, and those kind of words were asked in synonyms and antonyms. When it comes to analogy, there were 1 or 2 questions asked in almost all papers on analogy, where there was a word association analogy. Another thing was very important, sentence correction. There were errors on parallelism, there were errors on modifiers, and there were errors in tenses. So make sure you know this side of the grammar as well. Okay, so make sure you revise your tenses, revise the modifier errors, revise the parallelism errors, and revise comparative and superlative errors. When it comes to the final thing, there was word usage. There was this word, let's say for example game. Now where all this word will fit in how many sentences. So there were 4 sentences given as the option, and you have to find out whether it will fit in 1 of them, 2 of them, 3 of them, or all 4 of them, in other words, as an appropriate context. Alright, so this was about verbal ability when it comes to NMAT, one of the easiest section as per the feedback. As I mentioned earlier, there were 22 minutes allocated, however. So as per the timing, this was like a section which had less time as compared to the contemporary sections, the other sections that NMAT has, which are Quant and LR. So I would suggest the best method to kind of go through this section would be to solve these areas first. Do RCs in 2 goes. Like one of the RCs you may do it amid the paper, and the last RC, the second RC, you can do it towards the end of the paper. Make sure, since you know it's a fact-based. So summarizing the paper, we have 3 sections in NMAT: Quant, DI, LR and Verbal, that constitute 48, 40 and 32 questions respectively. So in other words, the ideal number of questions that you must get correct in all these sections would be somewhere between 30 to 32 in Quant and DI, somewhere between 25 to 28 in LR depending on the level of difficulty, and somewhere between 20 to 22 questions in Verbal. Okay, this will help you clear the sectional cutoff. Again, it depends on the difficulty level of the paper that you are attempting. However, the grand total cutoff usually has been fixed between 208 to 210. So you have to clear the grand total cutoff as well. So you'll have to maximize your scores in one of these sections, whatever you're strong at. So if you're strong at Quant and DI, you might push to two questions more. Similarly, the same works for LR and Verbal. Of these sections asked in NMAT, let's talk about certain things that you must take care of when you write your paper. So when it comes to Quant and DI section, it's the DI part. When it comes to LR section, there is input, output and series, and to an extent mathematical puzzles if at all. And Verbal, I wouldn't say anything, because Verbal practically you can solve everything. Everything is doable in Verbal. Now when it comes to Quant section, DI, and when it comes to LR section, these two are basically traps set by NMAT so that you waste your time and do not focus on the solvable one. So I recommend do not waste time on these things. So if you have a 3 set paper, like basically if a paper has 3 sets of DI, I would suggest a rejection time of around 45 seconds to 1 minute. Okay, what you do in these 45 seconds to 1 minute is look at the DI set, try to interpret the DI set. If you think that you'll be able to solve it within the stipulated time, only then go for it. Otherwise, do not solve all sets of DI. Just try to solve only one set of DI at the max, okay? Because the remaining two sets, if they are really difficult, the best recommendation would be to leave those sets. Same goes for input output in series. I would say the rejection time here should be 30 seconds to 45 seconds, not more than that. So look at a series for 30 to 45 seconds. If you think that you are able to trace the logic of the series, only then attempt this. Otherwise do not, because you have a lot more to solve when it comes to both quant DI and LR section, apart from these traps that NMAT has set for you. And that is the reason why people tend to waste a lot of time in NMAT, and that is why they kind of reach a borderline. They reach kind of 200. You might have heard a lot of them saying that I could manage 200, I could manage 202, because they kind of didn't allocate the time well. So we'll talk about time allocation and everything when we discuss one of the NMAT mocks that we have. Alright, that should be enough for now. This is how NMAT is, and this is how the experience has been of students who've taken NMAT by far. I hope you have a great time writing your NMAT, and I'll keep uploading more videos on NMAT as and when I get more updates on NMAT. Thank you very much. I hope you had a great time listening to this.